Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Summers. I'm on the Transportation Markets team here at 3 Degrees Group. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which will focus on the Canadian Clean Fuel Regulations, or CFR as it's known. This webinar is designed to give you a comprehensive overview of the CFR, how it can benefit you, and how 3 Degrees can help. The CFR can provide a revenue stream for commercial fleets, public agencies, municipalities, EV charging infrastructure providers, and hydrogen and renewable natural gas suppliers. Today's presentation will last approximately 20 to 25 minutes, which will leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Our contact information will be on the last slide, but you can always go to the website 3degrees.com and request more information. And please feel free to put questions in the Q&A as we proceed through the presentation. Before we dive into the CFR, I would like to provide a very brief overview of 3 Degrees, who we are and what we do. To start with, we are a mission-driven company. We make it possible for businesses and their customers to take urgent action on climate change, and everything we do is truly oriented toward that mission. As a result, we're a purpose-driven company. We have been in business for over 15 years and have been a certified B Corp for much of that time. We have won a number of Best in the World awards from B Corp and other organizations over the years. We see our role as that of a leading player in the environmental attributes and the environmental commodity space. And the type of activities that we'll be going to discuss today regarding the CFR is part of that work. Here is a sampling of some of the companies we work with. I won't read the list, but you can see that many are leaders in North America and globally. We also work with many smaller firms as well as with public agencies and municipalities, particularly in the transportation space that we'll be discussing today. If we look at 3 Degrees service offerings as a whole, you can see that we work on every aspect of a company's greenhouse gas emissions footprint, scopes 1, 2, and 3. And that can take the form of commodities or strategic consulting around understanding a firm's greenhouse gas footprint and creating plans to mitigate it. And while the focus of today's discussion will be on the CFR, we really encourage you to reach out to us if you want to learn more about how you can reduce your company's overall carbon footprint beyond just transportation applications. From a transportation perspective, 3 Degrees operates as what is known as an aggregator across the clean fuel standard programs. The work we do is basically helping folks access the incentive programs, including the CFR in Canada, the LCFS in British Columbia and California, and the other programs in Oregon and Washington State. We're a large player in this space with a significant number of credits generated to date, and we have registered more than 10,000 pieces of fuel supply equipment, including EV charging stations, hydrogen stations, and renewable natural gas fueling stations. We've been in this space a long time. We generated some of the very first credits in California under AB 32, and we know the space well. At this point, I would like to introduce Dave Meyer to present on the CFR. Dave is director of the Transportation Markets team here at 3 Degrees. He's in his 5th year at 3 Degrees. Dave earned his engineering degree at Georgia Tech and an MBA from Stanford. I always find Dave to be incredibly knowledgeable and dedicated to work we're doing. Dave, please take it away.
Thanks for that overview, John, and for the great introduction. So I wanted to start by just saying that the conversation today will primarily focus on opportunities for EVs under the CFR, but I know we have some folks who have registered who might be interested in some other fuels, so I'm happy to talk more about those as part of the Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. So as John mentioned, the clean fuel regulations came into effect in Canada in July, in terms of that's when obligated parties started accruing their obligations. And it really represents one part of Canada's approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the country. Similar to other clean fuel standard programs that preceded it, like those in California and Oregon, the focus is really on reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, in particular gasoline and diesel, and requires the carbon intensity of those fuel pools to come down over time, with a current target of a 15% reduction by 2030. So if we look at how the program actually operates, essentially the way that it works is that what we might call legacy fuel suppliers, fossil fuel suppliers, who are providing high carbon fuels, accrue deficits for the amount of emissions that their fuels exceed the cap in a given year. Whereas providers and users of low carbon fuels generate credits based on the amount their fuel is below the cap in a given year. That then creates a market where the deficit holders or the obligated parties need to procure credits in order to offset their obligation. The compliance period is an annual period, so the basis for resolving the obligation then happens annually. In terms of the ability to participate in the program and who can benefit from it, the main focus is on helping to pay for fleet decarbonization and really accelerating the pace of transportation decarbonization. And really anyone who has a fleet of vehicles that are using low carbon fuels, like electricity, green hydrogen, RNG, are able to benefit, as well as producers of some of those fuels. And at the end of the day, what the program really does is enhances the total cost of ownership considerations for a transition to low carbon fuel vehicles. In terms of the potential value that folks can realize under the program, this again is really focused on electric vehicles, and we've highlighted kind of the three most populous provinces when looking at these values. And as you can see, there's a potentially significant amount of money that is available for folks who are making this transition. I won't go through each of the applications, but you can see that the value can be quite significant, and that value really depends on a couple of different factors. One is the kind of vehicle that we're talking about. You can see here a few different examples. One is how much that vehicle is used. In other words, how much fuel is actually dispensed into that vehicle. And then the third in particular for EVs is where that activity is happening. And part of the reason that we focused on the three provinces shown here, one is because of their size, but two is also because of the carbon intensity of the grid in those provinces, which is very clean in each of those provinces. So the value for deploying an EV in those provinces is relatively high. If you're in another province that maybe doesn't have as clean a grid, then those values are going to be lower because there won't be as much credit generated for charging activity. Also worth noting, for these indicative values, we've assumed a $200 credit price, and that's in Canadian dollars. We have seen transactions in the market more in the $240 to $250 range, but still early days in this market, so hard to say kind of where that value will shake out. In terms of how the process works, one question that we often get is around verification. It's worth noting that when submitting compliance reports, in particular for compliance category 3, which is the compliance category that EVs fall into in terms of the credits that they generate. There's an annual report that needs to be submitted to Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is the regulator for this program. That report needs to be verified at the time that it is submitted. So in some other jurisdictions, there's a verification that kind of happens after the fact. But in Canada, the verification actually has to happen before the report gets submitted. So the way that this happens, this is again kind of an annual process. We will collect data from our charging partners, make sure that we review it and get it into a format that the regulator wants to see. At that point, we will engage with a verifier. We have strong relationships with a number of different verification bodies across Canada. We will engage with one of those entities to work through the verification process. They will do their audit, which entails reviewing the data, making site visits, things like that. And then they will issue a verification report on what we've submitted to them. That then gets submitted to ECCC, and the deadline for that submission is April 30th of each year. And once that report is submitted, then the credits get issued, and we take those credits to market and then remit value to our partners based on the value that is received. In terms of the work that we do to make sure that we're really maximizing value under the CFR, that really takes a number of different steps. First is we want to make sure that we're working with you to capture all of the eligible activity under the program, make sure that we understand the full scope of the work that you're doing and are gathering data associated with all eligible crediting activity. And we'll help you understand kind of what the value of that is or could be. And we'll also work through the pathway approval process if we need to do anything in terms of generating a pathway in order for you to participate. From there, it kicks into kind of our ongoing process of managing ongoing reporting and compliance, making sure that we're assessing the data, providing QA/QC on that data to make sure that it's going to pass muster with the verifier and ultimately the regulator. And then, of course, making sure that we're staying on top of regulatory reporting deadlines. As I mentioned, this is an annual process, so we want to make sure that we are, getting the data, collecting the data in time, processing it in time, working with the verifier, all to make sure that we're getting reports submitted timely. And then the last piece that we take on is the monetization of the resulting credits. Um, it's worth noting here that the obligated parties in these markets are big entities, right? It's the Shells, the BPs, the Parklands of the world, and they're really looking for lots of credits at any given time. This market is still early, so we're kind of still assessing where the market's going to go in terms of kind of an average transaction size. But in other more mature markets, the average transaction size is about 5,000 credits, or I should say the minimum transaction size is about 5,000 credits. Below that, the buyers aren't really interested in engaging. And so part of the value that we add is aggregating the credits from everybody that we're working with to make sure that we're meeting the demands of the entities that are ultimately buying those credits. And then the last point that I'll make there is just from a business model perspective, typically the approach that we take is essentially a percentage. We retain a percentage of the value that's generated from the credits that are created. But we do have other approaches where we can help ensure the value that you realize. So things like maybe providing a fixed price over a given term, or even potentially prepaying for credit generation so that you're able to recognize revenue more quickly. So those are approaches that we are certainly happy to talk about with folks. We want to make sure that we're providing the approach that best suits your needs. In terms of the cycle, again, we hit on a little bit of this in the verification slide, but just to kind of reiterate, it is an annual process that we're talking about here. So, we will annually go through that reporting process and make sure that we are complying with the April 30th deadline, and making sure that things are verified, and then taking the credits to market to monetize those once they are created. And I also mentioned this in the slide talking about the potential credit value, but the value does vary pretty significantly across the provinces. And so we're happy to help you understand kind of upfront what that value might be. And obviously we will make sure that the reporting takes all of that into account. So that's kind of the main meat of the presentation. We just wanted to give kind of a high level overview of the program, how it works, how we work within the program. So if you're interested in learning more or in potentially signing up, please reach out to John, and he can help conduct an analysis to understand what the potential value might be, and then help work through how to actually move forward in the program. But before we get there, we did want to open it up for questions. I see that we have a couple of questions that are already in the chat. So happy to address those. And then if folks have other questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can unmute you and allow you to ask your questions. So the first question: what's the current cost of a CFR credit? So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe to expand a bit on the program and how the credits work. There's actually essentially 6 different types of credits under the program. And the reason for that is activities can fall into one of 3 compliance categories, helpfully numbered compliance categories 1, 2, and 3. And then they can also apply to 2 different fuel types, gaseous and liquid. So those kind of that matrix, if you will, of compliance categories versus fuel types results in 6 different credit types, which is part of what's making it a little bit challenging to give a great answer on what the credit value is, because it really depends on which type of credit we're talking about. That said, as I mentioned, we did recently see a transaction in the market for compliance category 3 liquid class credits, which is what we would expect the majority of EV credits to be. That would be the credit type that we would expect those applications to generate. And that transaction was at 240 Canadian dollars. Different compliance categories or different fuel types, fuel categories might have different prices, but that's kind of where the market is for EV credits. The next question is April 30th, the deadline for the previous calendar year. Yes, for in particular for compliance category 3, that's an annual compliance deadline is April 30th, and that covers the previous year. So April 30th of 2024, we will be reporting on activity for all of 2023. Other compliance categories can actually report on a quarterly basis. So their deadlines are a little bit different, but for compliance category 3, that is how it works. Next question, will the CFR program disappear after some adoption threshold is met, or once some sort of metric? Could this program, kind of declare mission accomplished and go away? It's possible, but I would say that's not what we've seen in other markets. So, for example, California and Oregon, I think in particular, the program started and they had a compliance goal, I think initially when the program was adopted, of 2025, and then they had a rulemaking that pushed the timeline out to 2035 with kind of increasingly stringent targets out through 2035. California is in the process of going through a new rulemaking that will also extend that program. Currently, the program has a target of a 20% reduction by 2030. And they're talking about both strengthening the 2030 target and extending the program with a 90% reduction target by 2045. So I think what we've seen in these programs is that they get established, they set out an initial target or goal, and as they make progress towards that goal, they continue to extend it and make it more stringent. So I would expect that that's the way this program will continue to unfold, is that it will kind of continuously be updated to have more stringent targets. Next question, for end-use fuel switching compliance category 3, are there restrictions on the chargers? For instance, do they need to be made available to the public? There are, within EV charging in particular, there are 2 different types of entities who can participate in the program. One is called a charging site host, and the other is called a charging network operator. The charging network operator is for folks who are providing residential charging and or public charging. And in that case, it's basically the credit generator is basically whoever has the data associated with that charging activity. For charging site hosts, it's basically everybody else. And so we can think about folks like if somebody has a fleet of vehicles that they're electrifying, and that's a private fleet, even a public fleet, if they're being electrified and charging at a depot, or maybe somebody who's making EV charging available for their employees, right? They've got an office, they're putting chargers in the parking lot for their employees to use, but they're not actually for public use. All of those would be examples of folks who would fall into that charging network operator category. And the credit generator there is it's a little bit loose the way it's defined, but effectively most often it's going to be whoever owns the charger and ends up having it installed. Will credit market values decrease over time as fossil fuel production decreases? So in each of these programs, all of the Clean Fuel Standard programs, ultimately what happens is we end up in a market where the price is dictated by supply and demand. Supply is the credits that are generated for our low carbon fuel activity. Demand is the deficits that are generated for high carbon fuel activities and therefore the obligations that folks have to meet. And what we see is that it's really, yes, fossil fuel production goes down or fossil fuel sales over time go down. But again, the program gets more stringent every year. So all things being equal, as time goes on, 1 gallon of fossil fuels will generate more deficits each year. And 1 unit, whatever that might be, whether it's a gallon of renewable diesel or a kilowatt hour of electricity or a kilogram of hydrogen, 1 unit of low carbon fuel will generate fewer credits, again, because everything is judged relative to the annual baseline, and that annual baseline decreases each year. So even though fossil fuel production or sales might decrease over time, the supply and demand of credits might not be significantly impacted if the change in the baseline basically matches the rate at which fossil fuel demand is decreasing. So you see a lot of that kind of tug of war dynamic happening in the other markets as things like renewable diesel come into the market, but then the cap gets more stringent. So it's really hard to say is kind of the short answer to that question. It's really going to depend on the uptake of low carbon vehicles and low carbon fuels compared to the regulatory baseline as that changes over time. Next question is around the 6 different types of credits, and do obligated parties need to secure 6 different types of credits for compliance? No, but there are limits on the number of credits that can be retired in a given year from different credit categories. So for example, there's a limit for compliance category 1 that only 10% of the total credits that are retired in a given year can come from credit compliance category 1 credits. There's also a limit on the gaseous fuel credits, where only 10% of the credits retired in a given year can come from the gaseous fuel class. So no, you don't need to procure all 6 different types of credits, but there might be limits depending on the credit type. So for example, just to make sure that's clear, somebody could retire or could use 100% compliance category 3 liquid class credits to meet their obligation. And they would be totally fine in doing that. But if they had gaseous class credits or credits from compliance category 1, then there would be limits on how many of those that they could retire. What reporting obligations are there for fossil gas used? I'm going to assume that we're talking about fossil natural gas from that question, but please let me know if you're going a different direction there. Fossil natural gas, at least at the beginning of the program, is actually a credit generator because it has a lower carbon intensity than diesel, which is primarily the fuel that it's going to be displacing. So it is able to generate credits in the same way that other low carbon fuels can. And even though natural gas is itself a gaseous fuel, it's most often going to generate liquid class credits because it's displacing diesel fuel. So that's a little bit of a confusing nuance here, but the question when determining what type of or what class of credit is going to be generated is what fuel type is being displaced, not what fuel type is being used. So natural gas, fossil natural gas, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, all of those fuels are most commonly going to generate liquid class credits because they're going to be displacing liquid fuels. And yeah, so in terms of how to report there, it's really the amount of fuel that is generated, the type of vehicle that it's dispensed into. And then if we're talking about fossil natural gas, there's kind of what we would call an existing carbon intensity score that can be used for reporting. And so it's relatively straightforward to just kind of report that. If we're talking about renewable natural gas, then there's a separate process that we would have to go through to define the carbon intensity score of that fossil fuel or of that renewable natural gas. And so there's basically a pathway that has to be developed in order to obtain a carbon intensity score. Under the Canada program, there's kind of 3 different ways that you can generate or claim a carbon intensity score for a particular fuel. One is they have kind of a table of default values, and you can say, I'm going to use the default value for my fuel from this table. Those tend to be very conservative. So you can use it, but it's probably not going to be the best score to use. The second approach is I kind of liken it to like Legos or something, where basically there's throughout the fuel production chain, there's kind of different pieces that you can pull out. And so you can say, okay, my feedstock is manure. Therefore, that's going to have a carbon intensity contribution of X. And then I'm processing it in this way, which is going to have a carbon intensity impact of Y. And then it's being distributed that way, and it's going to have a carbon intensity impact of Z, right? And so you can kind of build up a pathway based on those kind of default values for different pieces of the operation to get you a score. Again, that's probably going to be relatively conservative. So the third approach is what would be under the US programs likened to a tier 2 pathway, which is where you go through a full life cycle assessment of the fuel and submit a pathway report to the regulator that then gets reviewed and verified, and you get a final carbon intensity score. It's going to be the most accurate but also the most time consuming. And of course, ECCC has decided to go its own way in terms of the LCA tool that they use. So there's a tool called OpenLCA, which is not the GREET model. It's not GH Genius. So the GREET model is primarily what's used in the US. GH Genius is what's used in British Columbia. So it's, another model that you have to be familiar with and use to generate that carbon intensity score. So there's a lot of information on that particular question. Hopefully within that I answered your question, but please let me know before if that didn't address what you were looking for. Let's see. One more question. How long does it typically take before a participating entity begins to see revenue from the program? Are there limitations on what revenue must be spent on? So for EVs in particular, reporting can begin the day after, or I should say, credit generation can begin starting the day after an application is submitted to the regulator. So what does that mean? Let's say you install a charging station and it comes online July 1st. If you were to work with us, for example, to do that reporting, let's say we get an agreement signed, there's a designator form that needs to be filled out and submitted to the regulator. Let's say all of that happens on August 31st, it gets submitted to the regulator. You can start taking credit for charging activity beginning September 1st. So kind of those first 3 months of July through August, or 2 months of July through August, when there was charging activity happened, but nothing had been submitted to the regulator in terms of an application, those 2 months are kind of lost. And when the compliance report is submitted at the beginning of the next year, it would really be for charging activity starting September 1st. So that's just one thing to note, is that timing is pretty important here, and moving relatively quickly is pretty important. Otherwise, there's the potential to be missing out on the ability to generate credits. In terms of how long it's going to take to see revenue, it really depends on when you get signed up under the program. Again, because it's an annual process, if you sign up in January of 2024, it's not going to be until the middle of 2025 before you see revenue, because we've got to submit the report at the beginning of 2025. Credits are going to get generated after that, and then they've got to get monetized. So it's really going to be mid 2025 before that revenue comes in. Whereas if you sign up in November of 2024, it's still going to be the middle of 2025 when that revenue comes in. Of course, it's going to be less revenue because you signed up in November instead of January, but it's going to be relatively the same timing. In terms of how revenue has to be spent, if you are a charging network operator, then you do have to demonstrate that 100% of the revenue earned by participating in the program went back into EV adoption or EV charging deployment. So there is that restriction. I believe you have a 2-year window to look at that, right? So you don't necessarily have to say all of my funds from 2023 were spent, in this way. You can kind of look at it over a 2-year period, but you do have to be able to demonstrate that as a charging network operator, that all of that value was spent back on EV adoption or deploying more charging. That requirement does not exist for other credit generators. So charging network operators or folks who are producing renewable natural gas or green hydrogen or things like that do not have that same requirement. It's really only the charging network operators. I do want to pause and just see if anyone, we have another question that has come in, but I do want to pause and see if there are any questions from folks that maybe you want to ask live. Feel free to, raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask. Also happy to keep answering the questions that are coming in through the chat. All right, not seeing any raised hands, so I'll go ahead and hit the next question in the chat, which is, are there crediting pathways for aviation and marine decarbonization? Yes. So sustainable aviation fuel can generate credits under the program. And one thing that's a little bit different about the Canada program from the programs in the US is that there's kind of an out-of-the-box ability for, in particular, marine, electric marine applications to generate credits. So if you were to deploy, let's say, an electric ferry in California or Oregon, that's not something that you can just kind of report on today. You have to go through, again, kind of a pathway process to get that equipment type approved by the regulator. But that's not the case in Canada. In Canada, they've already made a provision for that kind of vehicle under the regulation. So you could, deploy an electric ferry in Nova Scotia and start generating credits, basically immediately from that activity. So that was the last question that I saw in the chat. I will pause for another moment to see whether folks have any other questions. And again, feel free to put those in the Q&A or to raise your hand to ask any questions that you might have.
Well, David, it seems like we've answered everyone's questions. Thank you very much for really an excellent overview of the program and then answering the specific questions. For anyone who wants any more information, my email is on my screen there, or you again can always go to our website and request more information. This will be recorded and will be available as well on our website. So I think at this point, I want to thank you, Dave. Thank everyone for attending. Thank you, everyone who asked questions, and I look forward to seeing you again in our next webinar.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.